The humidity pressed down like a wet blanket, making the strings sticky under my fingers. July in Savannah was always brutal, but something about this evening felt heavier, more intense. River Street stretched before me, its worn cobblestones catching the last light of day. Dark patches showing where centuries of footsteps had worn the stone smooth. My old violin case lay open at my feet, a few crumpled dollar bills and loose change scattered across its faded velvet lining. 4 hours of playing, and I hadn't even made enough for dinner. Times were getting lean on River Street, too many performers competing for too few tourist dollars. Even my regular spot near the old cotton exchange wasn't pulling in what it used to. The ghost tour shuffled past, their guide's voice carrying over my half-hearted rendition of "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." I played louder, trying to drown out his practice spiel. The tourists barely glanced my way, too focused on their guide's tales of haunted warehouses and spectral musicians. 10 years ago, River Street had been different. Real musicians played here then. Jazzmen who'd been performing since before I was born, bluesmen who could make a guitar weep. Now it was all ghost tours and t-shirt shops. The sun dipped lower and the street lamps flickered to life, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, looking like gray ghosts dancing in the twilight. A container ship crawled past on the river, its horn echoing off the old warehouse walls. That's when I saw him. He stood in the shadows of Factor's Walk, an ancient violin tucked under his chin. His clothes might have been expensive once, but now they hung on his thin frame like clothes on a scarecrow. He played something I'd never heard before. Notes that seemed to catch in the humid air and hover there, making the moss dance and the shadows deepen. But it was his face that caught me. Empty. Like someone had reached in and scooped out everything that made him human, leaving just enough machinery to move the bow across the strings. A few tourists stopped to listen, their expressions changing as the strange melody washed over them. I watched a woman wipe away tears she didn't seem to know she was crying. A man with angry eyes suddenly softened, reaching for his wife's hand. The music built to a crescendo that made my chest ache, then stopped abruptly. The violinist lowered his instrument and began walking toward me, his movements stiff and mechanical. The case at my feet suddenly felt very far away. "You're in my spot," he said, his voice as empty as his eyes. No accent, no emotion, no life. Just words falling into the heavy air like dead things. I started to apologize, to gather my things, but he held up one pale hand. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said. "I'm done. The violin wants you now." He held out the instrument, its dark wood gleaming in the streetlight. Something about it seemed to pull at me like a half-remembered song you can't quite name. I started, but he was already pressing it into my hands. "It will give you everything," he said, those dead eyes finally meeting mine, "until there's nothing left to give." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness of Factor's Walk. The violin felt warm in my hands, like something alive. A drop of rain hit the cobblestones, then another. The tourists scattered, seeking shelter in nearby bars and shops. But I stood there, holding the strange instrument, as the rain began to fall in earnest. I didn't know it then, but that was the last normal moment of my life. The last time I would feel everything, wholly and completely, without understanding what a gift that was. The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the distance I heard what sounded like laughter. Or maybe it was crying. On River Street, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I took the violin home that night, a cramped studio apartment above a souvenir shop 3 blocks from River Street. The window unit hummed and dripped, fighting a losing battle against the Georgia heat. My neighbor's TV bled through the thin walls, the muffled sound of late-night infomercials providing a soundtrack to my restlessness. The violin lay on my kitchen table, looking oddly at home among the coffee-stained bills and past-due notices. In the harsh light of my single overhead bulb, its wood seemed darker, richer than any instrument I'd ever owned. No maker's mark, no identifying features, just smooth, age-darkened wood that seemed to drink in the light. I should have been more suspicious, should have wondered why a stranger would give away something so obviously valuable. But musicians on River Street were like that sometimes, passing instruments down, trading gear disappearing without warning. I'd seen talented performers vanish before, leaving only stories and empty spots on the cobblestones. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty face, heard that strange music. The violin seemed to watch me from the table, its presence filling my tiny apartment like smoke. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep, picked up the violin, just meaning to test it. The first note shocked me, pure and perfect, cutting through the humid night air like a knife through silk. The strings responded to the lightest touch, as if they'd been waiting for me. I played scales at first, simple exercises my first teacher had drilled into me years ago. But the violin wanted more. The music shifted, changed, became something I'd never heard before. Notes that made the air thick, that painted pictures in the darkness. A cat wailed outside. Someone down the street started crying. The TV next door fell silent. I played until my fingers bled, until the sun started to peek through my grimy window. Only then did I notice the tears on my cheeks, the way my hands shook. The music had pulled something from me. Some deep well of feeling I hadn't known I possessed, but it had given something too. When I finally slept, I dreamt of that empty-faced man. In my dream, he was young, vital, playing on a river street that looked both familiar and strange. People gathered around him, drawn by music that could heal their hurts, ease their burdens. With each song, he glowed a little less brightly. With each healing, a little more of him faded away. I woke to someone pounding on my door. "Hey," my neighbor's voice, thick with emotion. "Hey, violin guy." I opened the door to find Mike from next door, still in his grease-stained mechanic's uniform. His eyes were red, but clear. "That music last night," he said. "I've been so angry since Sarah left. Couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. But when you started playing..." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "First good night's sleep I've had in months. Whatever that was. Thank you." He turned and hurried away before I could respond. I watched him go, noticed how his shoulders seemed lighter, his step more confident. Inside, the violin waited on my kitchen table. In the morning light, it looked almost ordinary, almost innocent. But something felt different, the constant knot of anxiety in my chest. The one I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. Had loosened. Not gone, but transferred. Like the violin had taken it from me, used it to fuel whatever magic had helped Mike. I should have been worried, should have questioned what was happening. But all I could think about was playing again, about helping more people, about how good it felt to finally make a real difference. The violin seemed to hum in agreement. I didn't notice then that my coffee tasted flat, that the morning sun didn't warm me quite the way it used to. Didn't realize that while Mike's burden had lifted, something of mine had gone missing too. That's how it starts, I guess, not with a bang but with a song. With the slow, sweet surrender of self, traded note by note for the power to heal others' pain. The next night would be my first back on River Street with the violin. The night I'd begin to understand what the empty-faced man had meant about giving everything. But that's getting ahead of the story. My first night back on River Street started like any other. I set up in my usual spot, the worn cobblestones still damp from an afternoon shower. The old violin's case, I'd kept it, leaving my battered one behind, sat open at my feet, its dark velvet lining cleaner, deeper than my old one. The evening crowd was starting to filter in, that mix of sunburned tourists and locals that defined River Street after dark. A group of college girls in bright sundresses giggled past, their shoes clicking on the uneven stones. 2 old men sat on a nearby bench, sharing a brown-bagged bottle and decades of friendship. I started with something simple, a Shokan farewell, a piece I'd played 1,000 times before. But it came out different now, fuller, richer. The notes seemed to catch the last rays of sunlight, turning them into something you could almost see. The college girls stopped giggling, the old men lowered their bottle. A child pulling his mother toward River Street Sweets froze mid-whine, transfixed. The music moved through the crowd like wind through Spanish moss, touching each person differently. I watched a businessman loosen his tie, tears streaming down his face as some burden I couldn't see lifted from his shoulders. A young woman with tired eyes and a waitress uniform stopped, her exhaustion melting away like morning fog on the river. Tips began to fill the case, not just 1s and 5s, but 20s, 50s. I barely noticed. The violin was singing now, playing itself as much as being played. Each note pulled something from me, memories, feelings, pieces of my soul, and transformed them into healing for others. A ghost tour paused nearby, the guide falling silent mid-story as the music washed over his group. Even the Spanish moss seemed to dance differently, swaying to rhythms that hadn't existed before tonight. I don't know how long I played. Time felt different, stretched and compressed like taffy in the humid air. But eventually, I noticed my hands were shaking, my legs unsteady. The violin's neck felt slick with sweat or blood. I couldn't tell which. When I finally lowered the bow, the street was quiet except for the sound of the river. The crowd slowly dispersed, moving like people waking from a deep sleep. Many wiped their eyes, looking confused at their damp cheeks. Others just walked away, their steps lighter, their shoulders straighter. An old woman was the last to leave. She stood before me, clutching a worn handbag, her eyes clear and knowing. "Been coming to River Street every night for 30 years, she said, her voice soft but steady. "Not since Marie Laveau herself have I felt such power." She reached into her bag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "But power always costs, child. Always." She tucked the bill into my case and walked away, her shoes making no sound on the cobblestones. I counted the money with trembling hands, more than I'd ever made in a month of playing. But something felt off. The bills seemed less green somehow. The texture felt wrong under my fingers. Even the streetlights looked different, their warm glow reduced to mere illumination without comfort. That's when I saw him again, the empty-faced man. He stood in the shadows of Factor's Walk, watching. When our eyes met, he nodded once, a gesture of recognition, of understanding, of warning. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with a case full of money I could barely feel, and a violin that hummed with satisfaction. I packed up quickly, suddenly desperate to be home. But as I walked, I realized I couldn't remember what I'd had for breakfast. Couldn't recall my mother's voice, though I'd spoken to her just yesterday. The memory was there, but the feeling that should have accompanied it, the warmth, the comfort, the mild annoyance at her worrying, was just gone. The violin's case felt heavy in my hand, full of more than just money, full of pieces of myself I hadn't meant to give away. But even that realization felt distant, academic, like reading about someone else's loss in yesterday's newspaper. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, each step heavier than the last. The window unit was still fighting its losing battle with the heat, but I barely noticed the temperature. My neighbor's TV was still playing through the thin walls, but the sound meant nothing. The violin waited patiently in its case, ready for tomorrow night, ready to take more, ready to help me help others, one piece of my soul at a time. I should have been terrified, should have locked it away, thrown it in the river, run as far as I could. Instead, I set my alarm for tomorrow evening. After all, there were so many people who needed help, so many burdens I could lift, so many pieces of myself I could still give away. The old woman was right, power always costs, and I just didn't realize how high the price would be. A week passed, maybe 2. Time moved differently now, marked only by sunsets and the growing stack of bills in my dresser drawer. I played every night, each performance drawing bigger crowds, healing more people, taking more pieces of me. My phone had stopped ringing, or maybe I'd stopped answering it. Hard to care about social calls when you're forgetting how friendship feels. The morning paper sat untouched by my door, headlines about wars and politics seeming less real than the shadows under Factor's Walk. That's when Connor found me. I was playing near the river stairs, the setting sun painting the water copper in gold, colors I remembered should be beautiful. A container ship passed, its horn a lonely echo I could no longer feel in my chest. The music flowed easily now, pulling emotions from the crowd like a tide, drawing shells from the beach. A young mother's depression, lifting like fog. An old man's grief, dissolving into the humid air. A child's fear flowing into my violin and out as notes of healing. I didn't notice him at first, this tall Irishman leaning against the wall, watching with eyes that saw too much. Not until the crowd dispersed and he remained, nursing a beer that hadn't gotten any emptier during my 2-hour set. "That's some gift you've got there," he said, his Irish accent thick but gentle. Or some curse. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. I started packing up my violin, my movements mechanical, just music. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. And the river's just water, and the moss is just plants, and there's no such thing as ghosts in Savannah? He stepped closer, set his untouched beer on the wall. I've been watching you these past few weeks, watching what your music does to people, watching what it's doing to you. I should have felt something then, fear, maybe, or curiosity, but those emotions had been spent on other people's healing days ago. I'm Connor, he said, extending a hand I didn't take. I own Kevin Barry's up the street, and I think maybe we should talk. Not interested, I said, closing the violin case. The latches clicked like tiny gunshots in the evening air. No. Connor leaned against the wall, his presence somehow both casual and immovable. Not even if I told you I've seen that violin before? Not even if I told you I knew the last 3 people who played it? That made me pause. 3? Aye, though I suspect you've met at least one. His eyes, sharp beneath heavy brows, studied my face. Man with empty eyes? Moves like his joints have forgotten how to work properly? The violin case seemed to grow heavier in my hand. What do you know about him? Enough to offer you a job. Connor straightened up, gestured toward his pub. Regular spot at Kevin Barry's, 3 nights a week. Better money than the street, and... He paused, choosing his words carefully. And maybe a chance to understand what you're dealing with before it's too late. I looked up at the pub's worn sign, the windows glowing warm in the gathering dark. Through the glass I could see people laughing, living, feeling all the things that were slowly draining away from me. The violin hummed in its case, eager to help, eager to feed. Why, I asked, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. Because 30 years ago I watched a good friend play that violin until there wasn't enough of him left to even care about dying. Connor's voice carried the weight of old guilt. Because I've spent 3 decades trying to understand what it is, how to stop it. And because if you're anything like the others, you won't be able to stop on your own. The truth of his words should have frightened me, should have made me want to run, to hide, to throw the violin in the river and never look back. But all I felt was a dull curiosity, like reading someone else's story in a forgotten book. 3 nights a week, I heard myself say. Connor nodded, relief flickering across his face. Come by tomorrow night. Meet some people, including someone else who might be able to help. Who? Old Frank. Been playing here over 20 years now. He plays some Irish folk as sweet as honeysuckle. Connor paused again. Something dark passing behind his eyes. He knows things about music that ain't in any books. About what it can do. What it can take. A ship's horn sounded in the distance, long and low, like a warning. The shadows under Factor's Walk seemed to stretch toward us, reaching with fingers of darkness before retreating with the next pass of a car's headlights. Tomorrow then, I said, picking up my case. One more thing, Connor called as I turned to leave. That violin, it doesn't just take, it changes things, changes people. The ones you help, their healing comes with a price too. They just don't know it yet. I should have asked what he meant, should have demanded answers, but the violin was humming again. Eager to play, eager to help, eager to feed. Tomorrow, I repeated and walked away into the gathering dark. Behind me I heard Connor sigh. Or maybe it was the river, mourning what was about to happen. Kevin Barry's looked different at night, more sanctuary than pub, the old wood and brass glowing like something out of memory. The usual tourists had thinned out, replaced by locals who knew what nights the real music happened. Connor nodded as I walked in, gesturing to the listening room. That's Frank on tonight, he said quietly. Comes down from Virginia once a month for a week. I watched the Dublin-born musician work his way through a mix of Irish and Scottish folk songs, his voice carrying decades of stories. He played his guitar like a man possessed, not by darkness, but by the pure need to give everything to the music. When he looked up as I unpacked the violin, his eyes widened slightly. He missed a note, the first imperfect thing he'd played all night. Then his face settled into something like recognition, and he nodded toward the empty chair beside him. The violin hummed in my hands as I sat down. Frank didn't speak, just started playing again, an old Irish air that seemed to carry all the weight of the Atlantic crossing. I joined in, and the pub went quiet. The music rose like smoke, filling every corner, but where my violin pulled emotions from people like a tide drawing shells from the beach, Frank's music was different. He wasn't taking anything from the crowd. He was giving pieces of himself freely, pouring out everything he had into each note. It was beautiful, but it was costing him. Not in the supernatural way my violin fed, but in the way all true artists pay for their gift. When the song ended, he finally spoke, his voice carrying traces of Dublin beneath the years in Virginia. "You're better than the last one," he said, meeting my eyes. He fought it longer, though. Recognized what it was doing to him. Fought what? Frank started another song, something that felt of homesickness and hope. The hunger. Not the natural kind. The kind that makes us play until our fingers bleed, give until we're empty. His eyes flickered to my violin. "That thing you're carrying, it's different. It takes without asking, without giving you the choice to hold anything back." The music swelled, drowning out anything else he might have said. But I understood. Each note I played pulled something from me, transformed it, fed it to the crowd. Their burdens lifted while mine grew, their joy brightening as mine faded. But Frank, he gave freely, chose what to keep and what to share. That was the difference. When we finished, the applause was thunderous. Money flowed like water. Bills dropped in the tip jar, stuffed into my violin case, pressed into our hands by people too moved to speak. Frank took his share with a grateful nod, the way a man who's spent his life making music accepts his due. "You'll need to eat after that." Connor appeared beside us, 3 plates of shepherd's pie steaming on a tray. "On the house." I stared at the food, trying to remember what hunger felt like. Frank dug in with appreciation, every bite a conscious choice to keep going, to maintain enough of himself to play another day. "First time I've seen him play with anyone in years," Connor said, his voice low. "Must see something worth saving in you." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Connor's eyes went distant. "Been watching musicians come and go for decades. Some burn bright, some burn long. But Frank, he's mastered the balance. Knows how to give everything to the music without losing himself completely." Frank's hands never stopped moving on the strings, but he spoke again, his voice carrying over the melody. "You have to choose what to keep," he said. "That's the secret. Every night, I empty myself out for them. But I choose what to pour back in. Good whiskey, better stories, the quiet of the Blue Ridge Mountains." He smiled, small but genuine. "You have to refill the well, or eventually there's nothing left to give." I looked down at my violin, its dark wood seeming to absorb the pub's warm light. "This doesn't give me a choice." "No," Frank agreed, starting another song. "It doesn't. That's what makes it dangerous. Music should be an offering, not a theft." I played at Kevin Barry's 3 nights a week, watching the seasons change through the warped window glass. Frank would appear 1 week each month, like clockwork, making his journey down from Virginia. Each time I noticed how he'd arrive looking worn, tired from the drive and the weight of years. But the moment he stepped into the listening room, he'd transform. Not through supernatural means, but through the simple magic of doing what he loved. The violin grew stronger, hungrier, or maybe I just grew weaker, emptier. Frank watched it happening, his eyes carrying a sadness born of recognition. He'd seen others fall before, not to cursed instruments, but to the industry's grind, to addiction, to forgetting to keep something for themselves. Connor kept trying to warn me in his way. Stories about Irish musicians who'd played for the Fae until their souls wore away. Tales of devil's violins and crossroads bargains. But it was Frank's quiet examples that hit hardest. The way he'd stop playing to tell a story, share a drink with regulars, laugh at old jokes he'd heard 1,000 times. Little moments of refilling his well while my violin drained mine dry. One night, after a particularly powerful performance, Connor cornered me in the back hallway. "It's happening faster with you," he said, his accent thicker with worry. "The others, they took years to fade this much. But you're burning through yourself like kindling." I should have felt concerned, should have asked questions. Instead, I just nodded, already thinking about tomorrow's performance. "Listen to me," Connor grabbed my shoulder, his grip desperate. "There's still time. Still enough of you left to walk away. But soon." I glanced toward the stage where Frank sat, still playing. Not empty music now. I could see that was wrong. His music was full, alive, given freely rather than taken. That made it all the more painful to watch, knowing what my violin was doing to me. Frank caught my eye across the room. For a moment I saw him as he must have been decades ago, young, fierce, playing because he had to, because the music demanded it. But he'd learned to balance the giving and taking. I was just learning how much I'd already lost. You know what the real difference is, Frank had told me earlier that night during a break between sets. I chose this. Every callous, every missed dinner, every lonely night. They're mine. That thing you're carrying, it doesn't let you choose. It doesn't let you keep anything for yourself. The violin hummed in its case, drowning out my thoughts, or maybe I just couldn't hear them anymore over the sound of my own hollowing. That night I dreamed of the empty-faced man again, but this time he wasn't alone. Frank was there too, young and vital, playing songs that made the Spanish moss dance. And behind them both, something vast and dark and hungry, waiting to fill the spaces we carved out of ourselves, whether given freely or taken by force. I woke knowing two things: I was running out of time and I didn't have enough feeling left to care. Frank was playing again that night, his last set before heading back to Virginia. I watched him from the doorway, seeing how he poured himself into every note, but somehow kept his core, his self. He'd finish a heartbreaking ballad, then laugh at a regular's bad joke, alive in a way I barely remembered being. The violin hummed in its case, angry at my hesitation. A woman at the bar was crying silently into her drink. Recent widow, I could tell from the way grief hung around her like a shroud. So much pain I could take away, so much healing I could offer. All it would cost was whatever scraps of myself I had left. "You don't have to do this," Connor said quietly, appearing beside me. "There are other ways to help people, other ways to make music." Frank looked up from his guitar, met my eyes. His face showed understanding, not judgment. He'd walked this edge for decades, choosing what to give, choosing what to keep. But I was so tired of choosing. So tired of feeling. The violin's way was easier. Just let go, let it take everything, let it use what remained of me to heal others. I lifted the violin to my chin. One last time, I told myself. One last performance. The widow's pain called to me, promising purpose in exchange for whatever humanity I had left. The first note rang out pure and perfect and hungry. I felt it pull at me, felt it start to feed. But this time, I didn't fight. This time, I let it take everything. The last thing I remember clearly was Frank's face, not sad exactly, but knowing. He'd seen this before, would see it again. Some musicians burned out, some sold their souls, and some, like me, gave them away note by note until there was nothing left but the music and the hunger. I still play on River Street sometimes. The tourists love it. They say my music moves them to tears, heals old wounds, lifts burdens they didn't know they carried. They don't notice that my fingers move without my input, that my eyes are as empty as the spaces between notes. They don't realize that each song they request costs them something too, though they won't notice until it's too late. Frank still comes down from Virginia once a month, still plays at Kevin Barry's. Sometimes when our paths cross, he nods to me, one musician to another, though I'm not sure I qualify as either musician or another anymore. Connor still watches from behind his bar, still tries to warn the young players who drift through with stars in their eyes and hunger in their hearts. And the violin, it plays through me now, using what's left of my hands, my skills, my memories. There's so little of me left that sometimes I forget I was ever anything else. But on quiet nights, when the fog rolls in from the river and the Spanish moss dances in the dark, I think I remember what it felt like to make music because I chose to, not because something ancient and hungry chose me. They say there's a special kind of silence in Savannah, a thickness to the quiet that speaks of old magic and older sins. If you listen carefully on River Street, beneath the tourist chatter and ship horns, you might hear a violin playing songs that can heal any pain, lift any burden, ease any troubled soul. The music will call to you, promising comfort, promising peace. But don't listen too long. Don't let it pull at your emotions or tug at your memories. And if someone offers you an old violin with dark wood that drinks in the light, remember, some gifts come with prices too high to pay, even if you don't realize you're paying them until it's too late. After all, that's what music is supposed to do, isn't it? Move people, change them, heal them. even if the cost is everything you are.